April 3, 2013. It was a brittle spring night, the soil thawing, crocuses daring. The country, still raw from the financial crisis that had defined the previous decade, talked in the language of austerity and accountability. In that era of tightened belts and counted promises, our kitchen light glowed small and yellow. Under it, a laugh changed everything. For years his laugh had been a family punctuation, a reflex to soften, to sidestep rough edges. Friends read it as a cue to move on, relatives took it as an invitation to forgive. On April 3, 2013, the laugh landed differently. It was the sound of a confession folded into a joke, an attempt to compress culpability into levity. "You mean that money?" he said, and the laugh shifted the question into speculation rather than ownership. It was not outright denial, it was a strategy meant to disarm me and, perhaps, to keep responsibility at bay. What followed in those days was an economy of evasions. A misplaced bank transfer, an investment gone sideways, an expense that had come at the worst possible time. Each explanation stood plausibly alone. None contained the sentence I had been waiting for: "I'm sorry, I was wrong." Instead came pleas for understanding, practiced levity, and small logistical excuses. The laugh made the kitchen colder because it implied that the wound might not be acknowledged. It announced, without saying so, the possibility that what I had counted on might not exist as I believed. I left with two things in my pocket: the echo of that laugh and a legalistic list I began to assemble on the kitchen table. The list became a map: dates of promises, emails and texts that sketched a timeline, bank statements showing transfers promised but not posted, and names of witnesses who had heard assurances. Some items were mundane: a Thanksgiving email offering help after a job loss, a voicemail promising, "I'll make it right," a text about a scheduled transfer. Taken together, they acquired the weight of evidence. It felt almost absurd to trace intimacy like contraband, yet absurdity clarified: when truth arrives shrouded in laughter, it needs witnesses. 14 days passed between April 3 and April 17, 2013, and I moved through them like someone assembling a case. I printed emails, taped voicemails to paper, transcribed half-forgotten conversations. Pages spread across the dining table, chronology on the left, communications on the right, financial entries in the center. The pattern was not cinematic, no single fraudulent act, but a cumulative weakening, repeated small assurances that, compounded, left a yawning structural gap. The list gave contour where shock offered shards. On a Tuesday in mid-April 2013, I sat in the office of the lawyer I had called the night I realized something had to change. Her office smelled of coffee and old paper, the shelves of statutes looked like a skyline of precedent. She met Hurt with arithmetic and possibility. "You can pursue this," she said. "You can seek restitution." Then she balanced hope with reality: statutes of limitation, court fees, the prospect of countersuits, and the slow attrition of litigation. Mediation could bridge, litigation could burn. "You can win in court and still lose in life," she warned. We translated the kitchen ledger into legal language. From those records we crafted a demand letter, precise, impersonal, citing dates, requesting an accounting and a clear repayment timetable, closing with a quiet ultimatum: respond or expect further action. We drafted a promissory note template: installments, amounts, interest provisions for missed payments, remedies for default. We spoke of notarization and the strange psychological utility of formality: signatures and witnesses make promises outlive a moment. My lawyer reminded me paperwork could not dissolve pain but could mark intention. She cautioned that the cost, financial, temporal, emotional, might exceed the recoverable sum. Even so, she argued, formalizing a promise might restore something more fragile than money: credibility. Late April 2013 the letter arrived. There was no melodramatic denouement, only procedural calm. My parents responded with a modest, slow payment plan, an arrangement that could not rewrite lost years but would at least be a structure. My mother spoke more than my father, moving between defensiveness and a kind of rehearsed kindness, the quick laugh, the pivot to unrelated generosity. "We'll set something up," she said, promise performed in hope's currency rather than in fact. We asked the lawyer to formalize the plan. The notarized promissory note with specified dates, amounts, and methods of transfer did what conversation could not: it made intention an obligation. The first payment arrived in late May 2013. Awkward, small, accompanied by a message threaded with affection and implicit apology. Accepting money from parents as an adult creates a peculiar calculus, gratitude and grief measured on the same scale. The repayments bought breathing room, steady rent, medical copays, the ability to say yes to precarious opportunities. Transfers came with an awkward rhythm, automated month-end deposits, occasional delays blamed on late medical bills, the occasional paper check accompanied by arithmetic rather than apology. The ledger, the notarized note, bank entries, emails, became both instrument and reminder. Documents could measure transfers. They could not measure the relief of filling a prescription on time. Alongside the financial architecture, conversations shifted. My mother began asking for help with healthcare paperwork, forms, insurer calls, bureaucratic navigation, not to erase independence but as practical collaboration. My father asked for help setting up an email account after losing messages. These small requests were windows through which the relationship could be redone on clearer terms. There was no cinematic forgiveness. What emerged was slow, complicated, forgiveness appearing in the spaces between routine and crisis. We sat at dinners where old television shows and recipes coexisted with silences and half-laughed memories. Sometimes I resented the need for formalities. Other days I was grateful that administrative steps replaced improvisation. Outside the kitchen opinions multiplied. Friends urged mercilessness or mercy. Some counseled holding fast and demanding full restitution, others argued for indulgence given my parents' age. The dichotomy felt false. Accountability need not be cruelty, it can be a form of care. Holding someone to their word insists on integrity. Without boundaries, love calcifies into resentment and future assistance becomes performance. I learned to explain that treating promises as measurable commitments did not remove warmth, it preserved the relationship from contempt. A written agreement could be an act of kindness, protecting the promiser from forgetfulness and the recipient from being unmoored. At the community clinic where I ran educational workshops, I turned these lessons into a module called Financial Conversations. I built it from what had saved me, a simple promissory note template, etiquette for asking for help, scripts for refusing without burning bridges, instructions for automatic transfers, and distinctions between gifts and loans. The module taught narrative techniques for telling the story of a broken promise without letting it rewrite your life. Teaching sharpened my language. In role-play sessions we rehearsed an adult child requesting a written plan, a parent admitting a mistake, and negotiations about schedules and methods of payment. Participants told familiar, harrowing stories. Siblings torn between obligations, elders exploited, people who had learned to read laughter as dismissal. The demand for a vocabulary that named wrongdoing without collapsing into indignation was larger than I expected. In late 2014, I wrote an essay for a small magazine about the episode, less a howl than an observation on family language and the economy of shame. It circulated modestly online and drew letters. Siblings split between parents' promises and their own bills, young couples negotiating blended finances, elders fearing reduction to props in family dramas. The response surprised me and revealed a hunger for words that could make private problems visible without caricature. My story became a mirror for many readers, reflecting both personal choices and the structural condition of families serving as informal safety nets. There were social consequences. Older relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances learned about my parents' financial choices. Friends who had been casual with money began to look at them differently. Reputation, once ambient currency, needed rebuilding. My parents labored to do so, volunteer shifts at church, small public gestures, careful transparency about finances at gatherings. None of it erased the past, but collectively it altered the texture of present life. The next generation in our family learned different rituals. We made a game of saving, used play money to teach interest and long arcs, and taught children to ask practical questions. Can we write that down? And when will it be available? Language became a shield and a tool. One niece, after we drew a calendar and circled promise dates, asked, "Is it bad to ask?" I answered no. Asking for terms is caring for your future self. They carried those phrases like spells that helped promises take shape. The legal architecture settled into daily life. Notarizations and periodic consultations became furniture rather than blunt instruments. Formalities allowed choices I might not have made otherwise. In 2015, I accepted a fellowship that required stepping away from steady work. The cushion created by formalized repayment made that possible. The fellowship was a quiet sabbatical to write and begin repairs. In my writing, the laugh that once deflected became a signal to examine moments carefully. Private lessons led to public action. Between 2016 and 2018, I volunteered on a local council advising on elder financial protections. What began as private frustration became public prevention. We argued that families serve as default safety nets because public systems fail to support them. When kin are unprepared or unreliable, the system buckles. The council's work was incremental and tedious, reading regulations, convening meetings, drafting reports, but it felt like translating grievance into prevention. Between 2016 and 2019, the council recommended clearer bank disclosures, piloted programs to make account access more transparent, and organized community workshops on financial literacy for caregivers. These measures did not eliminate exploitation, but they were modest mitigations, attempts to turn private lessons into public safeguards. By April 2023, a decade after that laugh first took on new meaning, the household dynamics had shifted. My parents were older and more willing to accept help with clear boundaries. Routines settled: who drove to appointments, who organized medications, who handled finances. These were not heroics but practical kindnesses: a phone alarm for pills, a monthly review of refills, a folder of medical histories. Sometimes I resented responsibility, other times I was grateful to craft a less performative relationship. The ledger remained, the promissory note, transfer dates, emails, but by 2023 those artifacts did not define the family. We ate together, watched movies, traded embarrassments and jokes. The laugh still surfaced, but it had lost its power as a deflection. It was now an old habit that softened edges rather than erasing responsibility. When it appeared, it might be followed by a quiet apology or a clarifying question. Avoidance began to be interrupted by care. There were moments of reconciliation. In the autumn of 2019, my father sat me down without laughter and spoke plainly. He had been afraid of being judged his whole life, and his endless promises were a way to keep loving while avoiding the look of failure. He did not ask for absolution. He asked to be seen as a man trying to do better. I accepted, not because the ledger balanced, but because people can change in small, reliable ways. The conversation reframed the past so forward motion was possible. It taught a shared vocabulary: promises are commitments that need witnesses. On a practical level, I kept rituals to prevent regression. Annual financial check-ins with my partner became sacred, reviewing accounts, savings, joint obligations, and long-term objectives, retirement, travel, contingencies. We kept a joint emergency fund and separate accounts for personal projects, revisited rules when careers shifted or illness came close, and mapped who would contact insurers or hold passwords. These conversations were exercises in mutual respect, money as one language of care, and planning as a form of presence. People asked whether I regretted pursuing the matter with my parents. The answer is layered. There were regrets. Nights when confrontation felt too high a cost, conversations that could have been better conducted. There were satisfactions: the ability to take opportunities without terror, the peace of transparency, and the precedent set for nieces and nephews. A particular sorrow remains, an ache for what was lost, but it no longer hijacks future plans. The ledger bought options that felt like dignity. The practicalities of accountability are both banal and profound. A promissory note is paper, a notarization a stamp, transfers are lines in a ledger. The banality is the point. Mechanical acts protect relationships from the vagaries of memory and the temptations of easy excuses. Rituals of documenting, assigning dates, and meeting obligations allow promises to live outside intention. Enabling differs from supporting. Enabling is doing for someone what they can and should do. Supporting is creating conditions for agency. A formal agreement can be supportive, structure that lets someone rebuild habit without being shamed into silence. The work of rewriting family patterns is ongoing. Some days the ledger is a comforting talisman, others it feels like a scar. New generations carry protective phrases. Partners practice candor at kitchen tables. Elders can ask for help without losing face. Community teaching, public advocacy, and a rota for care are not cures but guardrails. If there is a condensed truth here, it is this: promises matter because of follow-through. When promises have material effects, they require terms. Asking for those terms is not ingratitude but stewardship of gratitude's future. Protecting oneself is not necessarily betrayal. Sometimes it is the only way to preserve love. Love without accountability collapses into enabling. Accountability without compassion hardens into cruelty. The task is to hold both in view. I have kept the ledger. I still hear the laugh sometimes. But neither paper nor sound rules my life. They are notes in a larger chorus where law, ritual, clarity, and tenderness each have parts. My responsibility now is to keep singing with clarity, to teach, to advocate, to insist on terms, and to make room for mercy that is earned rather than assumed. The ledger does not define us, but it protects the possibility of becoming better. What followed the rights of paper and the slow accretion of small repayments was not a tidy settlement but a sequence of ordinary reckonings that stretched over years. Exchanges where money was never simply cash but a ledger of memory and expectation, and where every deposit or pause carried weight. In the spring of 2014, when my parents' laughter first became a signal I could read, it felt like a rupture. By the time April 2023 arrived, it was one of many landmarks on a longer road. Between those dates and after them, the $144,000 that had been promised as my rent was both a sum and a story. The math remained the same, while the meanings shifted with each seasonal turn. The promissory note I had insisted upon in 2014 achieved something simple and stubborn. It turned an evanescent vow into a record. The note listed the principal amount, $144,000, the dates of scheduled transfers, and the account numbers into which payments would be made. It did not narrate motive or excise shame. That, in practice, mattered. There were transfers, some regular, some intermittent, between 2015 and 2020. A pattern emerged: modest monthly payments through 2016 when my mother took on part-time bookkeeping work at her church, larger, irregular deposits in 2018 when a family friend settled an estate, and a pause in 2020 as the pandemic constricted incomes and unleashed new anxieties. By the start of 2021, the note documented approximately $60,000 repaid. The arithmetic was blunt: $84,000 remained outstanding. The ledger reflected choices as much as numbers. What money was spent on, what was hoarded, what was given away. The presence of the ledger changed my options. In 2015, the secured cushion allowed me to accept the fellowship. The note's existence provided a practical assurance that work and risk could be balanced by accountability. Later, in 2019 and 2020, it was clear that the same principle could be applied to elder care. When my mother fell in June 2024, an accident that left her with a fractured wrist and a slow dislocation of confidence, those decades-old promises took on new valences. Medical visits, physiotherapy, and home modifications cost money and demanded coordination. The promissory note did not cover emergency care, but it did provide a script for difficult conversations. Who pays now, who will reimburse later, what counts as a loan and what is a gift. We convened in my parents' living room in July 2024 and read the document aloud. This literality felt obscene and consoling at once. The laugh my father made surfaced, short, reflexive, before he put his face in his hands and said, "I thought I had time." By late 2024, the family faced three intertwined decisions: whether to accelerate repayments toward the outstanding $84,000, whether to formalize a repayment plan into the estate, and how to allocate diminished resources without hollowing out the present. The first decision was practical. We met with our financial planner in September 2024 and prepared a cash flow projection. The planner ran scenarios that balanced ongoing care and conservatorship contingencies against a desire to honor the note. The planner's baseline assumed no extraordinary windfalls, modest withdrawals from my parents' savings for care, and a plan to make monthly repayments of $1,500 toward the outstanding balance. That schedule would clear the $84,000 in roughly 56 months, uncomfortable but possible if incomes held and if no catastrophic expenses intervened. The second decision required legal work. In October 2024, we consulted an estate attorney to draft an addendum to the promissory note that mapped repayment plans to estate distributions. The attorney explained, with a clarity that felt at once cold and humane, how intestate law and executorship operated, and how the note could be made a priority claim against any residual estate. We agreed to create a document that tied future repayments to specific transfers from my parents' living trust, should a sale of assets be necessary. The attorney also advised that some jurisdictions view long-standing familial payments as gifts for tax purposes, a nuance that complicated accounting but did not alter moral obligations. The paperwork was notarized in November 2024. The signatures were careful, deliberate. One of the last pages recorded a phrase my father had used for years: "I'll take care of it," and beside it, in my mother's careful script, a date and a figure. The third decision was the most intimate: how to live with less certainty without becoming resentful. We restructured household duties. My sister took on pharmacy pickups. I coordinated doctor's appointments. We converted the garage into temporary living space to fit a walker and a hospital bed. We bought a medical alert system and enrolled my father in a weekly men's group at the senior center. Those gestures were not payment in cash but repayment in time and attention. They were also exchanges that remade patterns of dependence. My father's laugh, which had once been a strategy, was still a fixture of his speech. In December 2024, a family meeting crystallized what had been simmering: emotion, arithmetic, and the knowledge that health could tilt the table at any minute. He made two modest payments, $5,000 in December and $7,500 in January 2025, transactions that appeared in the ledger beneath the notations of physical therapy bills. The transfers did not equal full restitution. They were, however, evidence that the rituals of accountability had taken hold enough to alter behavior, if only fractionally. Then, in January 2025, two things accelerated the timeline. My father's health declined precipitously and hospice conversations entered the room. He had always been proud of his autonomy. The loss of it was a humiliation I could taste. We spent long hours at his bedside. We read letters, catalogued photographs, and reconciled minor grievances. He was lucid on some mornings, a man capable of nuance and apology. On others he retreated into jokes, his last habit, and the laugh bubbled up, thin and apologetic. He told stories I had heard 100 times but listened as if they were new. He said, "I wanted you to have it, but I wanted to keep the idea of it too." He did not ask for absolution, he asked to be understood. When my father died in March 2025, the immediacy of loss reframed the ledger again. Probate followed the script the estate attorney had outlined in November 2024. There was a living trust and a will, both of which honored some debts and deferred others. The estate included a small condominium, modest investment accounts, and annuities that paid modest monthly amounts. There was no sudden windfall. The estate paid funeral costs and some debts. The remaining assets were divided according to the will, which recognized the promissory note but did not cover the full outstanding $71,500 remaining after the December and January payments. The executor, with the tacit instruction of the will, arranged for monthly payments of $1,000 until funds were exhausted. The remainder was documented as an unsecured claim against the estate. The legal outcome annoyed and grieved me in measures both predictable and new. Part of me had expected the ledger to materialize in full and to vindicate a long campaign of boundary setting. Part of me had always known that memory and law diverge. The will's partial satisfaction of the debt left a residue of feeling that the family's last practical acts had been constrained by the limits of income and the pressure of present need. Still, the estate's partial payments were not nothing. They were, in their own way, an expression of responsibility. The promissory note had given me leverage I would not have had if I had only relied on memory or on the good humor of a man who could laugh away obligations. The social consequences rippled outward. Relatives reacted in predictable configurations, some resentful that I had pursued the note persistently, others grateful that the matter was at last formalized. A cousin I had not spoken with in years called and said quietly, "You did the right thing." My neighbors, aware of the family's history through the essay and my teaching at the clinic, offered condolences and practical help. The counsel work I had done between 2016 and 2019 found its echo in small, concrete reforms that had matured while these private reckonings unfolded. In 2022, the county adopted stronger bank notification protocols for joint accounts, and by 2024, a local nonprofit had scaled the Financial Conversations module to 3 nearby community centers. Those measures did not retroactively change my ledger, but they did create new norms that might spare others the same bewildering hinterland where love and money overlap. In the months after the estate closed, through mid-2025, I turned attention to translation, how private loss and partial satisfaction could become public resources. I revised the Financial Conversations module to include a unit on end-of-life planning, estate claims, and the differences between gifts, loans, and informal promises. I collected anonymized case studies for the workshops: a cousin who had cared for an aunt for a decade with no record, a neighbor whose gift theory of family transfers left a daughter unemployed because the money had been spent, a man whose father had used the word rent to evade commitment. Each story was accompanied by practical forms, checklists, and scripts for soft conversations. How to say, "I need the money back," without turning gratitude into weaponry. The module emphasized witness-taking, not as punishment but as a testable, humane practice. Promises that are observed are more likely to be kept. In parallel, I engaged with the local council again to push for small statutory changes. My experience in probate made clear that promissory notes among family members often depreciated into unsecured claims unless carefully drafted. In October 2025, the council convened a panel on family obligations and estate enforceability. We drafted model language for a family loan clause that could be appended to wills or trusts, clarifying whether intrafamily transfers were intended as gifts or loans and allowing for limited notarized schedules to be admitted into probate without additional litigation. The clause did not solve every moral quandary. One cannot legislate shame or erase years of mismatch, but it offered a simple template that courts and families could use to reduce ambiguity. Small bureaucratic provisions, I argued, are a kind of kindness. They reduce the moral labor strangers and descendants must do to repair what was muddled. There were, inevitably, ethical cross-currents. Some criticized the push for formal instruments as commodifying family relations. They argued that the act of turning a promise into a legal instrument corrodes intimacy. I agreed insofar as legalism must not be the only grammar of care. But I also insisted, consistently and stubbornly, that the absence of record can be cruel. The $144,000 had been promised in laughter and in good faith. Its absence had been felt as betrayal. A paper trail can be a form of respect, allowing both the giver and the receiver to manage expectations with dignity. On a human scale, the ledger left marks. My father's laugh persisted in memory, now refracted by grief and an odd affection. Sometimes, alone in my kitchen, I would hear it and feel both irritation and tenderness, an odd pairing that held the complexity of our shared life. The reparative months after his death included conversations with my mother about what dignity means for the last years of life. She was not wealthy, she was practical. We reorganized accounts, simplified subscriptions, and designated a power of attorney. She insisted on modest gifts to grandchildren, socks, small cash allowances, concluding, with that same stubborn gentleness that had both saved and complicated our life, that small pleasures were worth preserving. I argued only for transparency, not thriftlessness. We agreed on a set of rituals: monthly account reviews, a jointly accessible spreadsheet, and 2 named witnesses for any future financial undertakings. The lessons of the ledger extended outward to the next generation in concrete ways. The nieces and nephews who had once played with play money now bore witness to estate discussions and attended workshops where they learned to ask for, and to give terms. One niece, in college in 2026, texted me a photo of a typed promissory agreement she and her boyfriend had drafted to cover a joint lease. The document made her laugh, and then she said it made her feel as if she had adult hands. Other families adopted similar practices. Surprise gifts were still possible, but larger promises tended to be written and witnessed. In public writing, I continued to translate these private events into a broader cultural query. Why do families serve as informal states of last resort, and how might modest forms of infrastructure reduce the harm? The essay I had written in 2014 had become a door. The post-2025 work felt like the slow process of building a room beyond it. I published pieces in regional outlets about the ethical architecture of family finance, joined panels at eldercare conferences, and advised a small foundation that funded pilot projects connecting legal clinics with senior centers. The aim was not to criminalize laughter or to cast familial improvisation as immoral. Rather, it was to make explicit the trade-offs families routinely accept when public support is absent and to suggest pragmatic tools to help them balance care and accountability. The story of $144,000 persisted not as a tallyhead but as a case study. People asked whether pursuing the promissory note had been worth the strain. My answer remained nuanced. There were nights I wished I had let the past lie fallow. There were afternoons when the ledger felt like armor and other times when it felt like a barrier between past love and present intimacy. The partial repayments, the estate settlement, the formalized documents. They bought something that no ledger can price: the capacity to take on risk without being haunted by unresolved promises. That capacity allowed me to work beyond fear, to take public roles, and to teach others how to build their own guardrails. By mid-2026, the rituals were habituated enough to seem ordinary. The promissory note, the notarized addendum, the estate clause, they were artifacts in a file folder that I kept in an unlocked drawer, sometimes out of reach and sometimes reached for. My mother was smaller. Her laugh had softened into a shared shorthand. The lessons made room for grief and for small reconciliations. They did not erase the past. Instead, they allowed the past to be accounted for, to be held as a chapter in a larger family narrative that continued. In the end, the work that had begun with a promissory note and a laugh had become, in many ways, about the preservation of agency. Promises, when recorded and honored, preserve future selves from being impoverished by present generosity. Promises, when left unexamined, become instruments of deferred obligation and hidden shame. I am still learning to navigate those borders, how to insist on terms without hardening the heart, how to accept imperfect restitution without collapsing into bitterness, how to teach that accountability can be an act of care rather than a punitive measure. The ledger remains. The laugh continues to surface at times. Both are part of an unfinished story that I am still living into, one in which the arithmetic of loss and repair keeps unfolding and where the work of turning private grief into public practices goes on in the months and years ahead. In late 2026, I found myself keeping two calendars: the small, practical one my mother used for appointments and the larger, annotated one I used for public work. The dates on the latter were a map of how a personal grievance had been institutionalized: a clinic talk in September 2026 about joint accounts and elder fraud, a roundtable at the Regional Bar Association in November 2026 reviewing the draft family loan clause, a community training series that began in January 2027 aimed at caregivers and grandchildren. Each entry carried with it an echo of the ledger: the promissory note that had started everything, the $144,000 figure that had lived for years like a secret architecture of expectation, the $71,500 that remained formally unpaid after the December and January payments when the estate was parceled out. The ledger had not gone away. It had migrated into the public sphere as an object of policy interest and as a recurring motif in conversations about what families owe each other and how the law might help clarify when obligations are transfers of affection and when they are transactions. The first tangible policy shift happened in March 2027 when the County Board adopted, in amended form, the model family loan clause we had drafted in October 2025. The clause did not purport to settle every contested promise. Rather, it offered testable language, a clear binary in wills and trusts for whether transfers were intended as gifts or loans, an option to append a notarized schedule of intrafamily transfers with limited evidentiary weight, and a two-witness requirement for any such declaration under a minimal form. The language was modest. Its novelty was procedural. It allowed probate clerks to admit a notarized schedule without litigation if it met formal criteria. For me, the change felt less like victory than like a small clearing of bureaucratic brush, something that would, in time, allow other families to avoid the middle ground that had cost me both time and tenderness. By June 2027, several community groups had adopted the revised Financial Conversations module. The nonprofit that had scaled the program in 2024 extended its license to 4 more centers and posted the module online with an accompanying workbook we developed with pro bono lawyers. These resources included sample promissory notes, witness scripts, and a plain language checklist for end-of-life conversations. The aim was practical: give people words and forms that could be used in ordinary kitchens without turning every gesture of care into a cold contract. There was a recurring ethical debate. Some caregivers worried that legal forms would dampen spontaneity, while others welcomed the discipline as a protection for caregiving labor that too often goes unpaid and unrecognized. We tried, in every workshop, to hold both truths: that effective generosity should not be penalized by ignorance, and that modest legal scaffolding could preserve affection by clarifying outcome risk. The work carried emotional labor on my side as well. In August 2027, I sat for an hour in my mother's kitchen, a cooling pitcher of water between us, and we went over the old bank statements again. She wanted to be precise, I wanted to be gentle. We talked about the laugh my father used when he deflected money talk, and about the way he had said in 2013, "We'll see about that." Words that had later been remembered as promises by some and as half-joking by others. We marked each transfer on a timeline. There was a peculiar relief in that exercise. Not only did it produce clarity for estate planning, but it also allowed both of us to honor memory rather than to weaponize it. The ledger, on paper, became a story we could narrate together. The promissory note became one chapter rather than the entire book. Not every relational fissure closed. Some relatives, who had earlier expressed hurt at my insistence on the promissory note, remained distant. A cousin who had been lukewarm in 2025 wrote in 2027 to say that he felt I had been too legalistic, that I had taken family air out of the room. He was not alone. But others reached out with offers of help I had not expected. A neighbor who offered to take my mother to appointments once a week, a former student who recommended a bookkeeping volunteer program for seniors. Small practicalities accumulated into an altered social fabric. The modest institutional interventions, bank notifications, the family loan clause, workshop curricula, worked in parallel with the human network we were forging. Neither alone would have sufficed. In the spring of 2028, the state judiciary invited our panel to testify before the probate subcommittee. We had been careful, in every draft and every public presentation, to insist that formalization was a tool, not a theology. The subcommittee's interest was pragmatic. Judges were weary of family disputes that clogged dockets and wasted scarce assets on litigation, and county clerks wanted clearer standards for admitting inter-family instruments. Our testimony emphasized a simple point observed over the course of my clinic work from 2016 through 2019 and then again in the family workshops. When a promise is recorded contemporaneously with a transfer, the probability of later enforcement increases, and the moral injury to heirs decreases. The judiciary, in a tentative ruling in November 2028, adopted a set of guidelines encouraging tribunals to give greater weight to notarized schedules attached to wills where the decedent's intention was clear and witnessed. The ruling did not change my own estate settlement retroactively. It was forward-looking, a hedge against future misunderstandings. The psychological project continued alongside the policy work. Grief, I had learned, is not a single state. It is a chronicle with chapters that sometimes contradict one another. There were days in 2028 when I would open the drawer with the promissory note and feel a quiet, satisfied sense that the instrument had done its work. There were other days when I would find myself smiling at the memory of my father making pancakes in 1998, when money seemed small and laughter large. Those memories did not cancel ledger entries, they sat beside them. In a public lecture in February 2029 I said, to an audience of social workers and family law attorneys, that records were not antithetical to tenderness. On the contrary, I argued, some forms of documentation are precisely the conditions of generosity. They free the giver from future coercion and the receiver from future shame. As the public work deepened, I found opportunities to bring the lessons into institutional practice. In late 2029, a small foundation offered a 2-year grant to establish a pilot probate clinic partnership in 3 counties. The idea was simple: embed legal counsel into senior centers and bank branches during high-volume times, tax day, winter heating assistance enrollment, college move-in weekends, so that routine transfers could be accompanied by quick, affordable legal advice and simple written forms. We evaluated the pilot with qualitative interviews and found patterns familiar from my own family's experience. Couples who used the clinic to document a loan reported less post-death conflict. Caregivers who had a witness form negotiated more sustainable in-home schedules. The pilot did not solve poverty or rearrange structural inequities. But it did, for several hundred families, reduce the brittleness of informal systems. Even as programs multiplied, there were ethical tensions that resurfaced in new configurations. Some activists argued that formalizing family promises could be used by wealthier relatives to pipeline obligations back into estates and away from public social safety nets. I took these critiques seriously. The very existence of a $144,000 promise in my family had been shaped by broader social insufficiencies. Gaps in long-term care provision, shrinking public housing supports, and precarious job markets that make families the default safety net. Our interventions, I said often, should be accompanied by advocacy, document promises to protect people, but also fight for stronger public supports so that familial obligation is not the only place where life's most consequential risks are managed. On a smaller, quieter track, the unsecured claim against my father's estate lingered in my own household budget and in our familial conversations. The estate's $1,000 monthly payments, arranged by the executor until funds were exhausted, had been helpful for a time, but they did not restore the full expectation. I had, by 2029, reconfigured some financial plans, an emergency fund, a small investment portfolio for my mother's needs, and a limited reserve to cover legal advice for the kinds of disputes that arise even among close kin. These measures were pragmatic and, in their cumulative effect, liberating. They did not blot out the ledger, they simply reduced the ledger's capacity to dictate daily choices. There were moments of slow repair that felt almost accidental. In 2028, a niece, now graduated and beginning her first job, invited me to over vegetable stew. She said she had used the templates from the workshop to draft a simple plan with her mother for a shared rental deposit and had added 2 witnesses. She said it felt grown-up, and she asked gently whether I had ever regretted turning the promissory note into a claim. I told her that regret and resolution had coexisted, that both were part of learning. She nodded as if that were itself an answer, and for a moment the ledger felt like a map being read aloud by a new generation. Public recognition followed in odd forms. A 2030 anthology on family finance included my essay about laughing promises and the probate process, and several community programs referenced our county's family loan clause as a model. Those recognitions were gratifying, but what mattered more were the quieter indicators. A neighbor volunteering to take my mother to a clinic appointment in 2029, a caregiver telling me in 2030 that a brief witness script had given her the courage to ask for reimbursement from a relative, a county clerk reporting in 2029 that the number of contested probate filings involving intrafamily transfers had decreased modestly. Through these years, the laugh my father used to dismiss debt, easy, dismissive, sometimes cruel, kept returning as a sound that could now be heard in different tones. It could be affectionate, recalling a man who loved his family in ways that were not always financial. It could be infuriating, a reminder of promises never meant to be enforced, and sometimes it sounded to me like an emblem of contradiction, the simultaneous capacity for humor and for harm. I did not reconcile these meanings fully. Reconciliation felt less like an event than like a practice, a daily habit of naming, logging, and deciding what to carry forward. By the start of 2031, the work felt, in some respects, stabilized, model clauses used in several counties, a statewide judicial guideline that allowed notarized schedules limited probative force, workshops embedded in 3 nonprofits, and a growing network of legal clinics offering low-cost advice during community events. At home, my mother and I maintained the rituals we had begun. Monthly account reviews, a shared spreadsheet, and 2 witnesses for any significant transfer. The promissory note remained in the drawer. It was no longer an instrument of pending litigation but a historical document, a ledger entry that had moved the family into a different practice of conversation and care. The ledger's moral mathematics continued to teach me about leverage and vulnerability. There were days when the unsecured claim felt like a wound, but there were also days when it felt like a lesson in the limits of law. Promissory notes can be enforced, wills can be interpreted, and clauses can be grafted onto trust instruments, but none of those instruments guarantees repair of the intimate debts that accrue through care, forgetfulness, and affection. What law can do is provide clarity, enforceability in some cases, and a scaffold for memory. What law cannot do is make people feel differently about the past. That is work for conversation time, and sometimes, for rituals that hold both loss and love. I still teach at the clinic, and I still revise the Financial Conversations module when new patterns arise. Students ask, with the eager cadence of people learning to hold others' secrets responsibly, whether a promissory note always makes sense. My answer remains, it depends on the context, the capacity of the parties, and the network of support around them. The note that began with a laugh had, over a decade and a half, produced ripples. Policy tweaks, workshops, a pilot program, a small change in probate practice, and quieter shifts in how my family navigated money and memory. The arithmetic of $144,000, of $71,500, of monthly $1,000 payments. All of it remains as part of that history, and as part of a future that is still under construction because families, like laws, are never finished. They are always in the process of being revised and re-argued, remembered and renegotiated. And so the work of translating private laws into public practice continues into the years ahead. The years that followed felt less like a sudden denouement and more like a slow accession of small events that altered the contour of an old argument. The pilot probate clinic partnership, that had begun with a 2-year foundation grant in late 2029, wound down in November 2031. We published its final report in March 2032, 3 counties, roughly 1,200 clinic interactions during peak periods, and qualitative improvements for several hundred families. An array of interview excerpts that echoed the stories I'd heard in my own kitchen and in the workshop rooms. The report did not claim to have solved the structural problems that made families default safety nets, but it did offer an empirical finding that mirrored the intuition driving the project. When a transfer or a promise is accompanied by a contemporaneous, witnessed, and simply worded document, the probability of later dispute declines and the emotional labor of heirs is reduced. The legal architecture shifted in modest, consequential ways. In January 2032, a state appellate court in our jurisdiction, having reviewed a contested estate matter where a daughter produced a signed schedule attached to a will, explicitly cited the judiciary's November 2028 guidance and the pilot's empirical report. The court affirmed that contemporaneous schedules and notarized attachments ought to be given greater weight when the instrument was clear, properly witnessed, and consistent with other documentary evidence. The case, reported in the Regional Reporter in March 2032, did not affect my own unsecured claim, which had been resolved administratively years before with the $1,000 monthly payments until estate funds were exhausted. It did, however, produce a tangible precedent for future disputants and creative attorneys. Legislative attention followed the judge-made law. In the spring of 2033, a coalition of probate clerks, elder rights advocates, and conservative legislators introduced a bill to codify the principle that contemporaneous family schedules should be admissible and carry probative weight, provided they met specified formalities: a dated signature, 2 independent witnesses, and a clear statement of intent regarding repayment or non-repayment. The political coalition was peculiarly bipartisan. County clerks wanted administrative clarity, aging advocates wanted protection against surreptitious predatory behavior, and some legislators saw an opportunity to reduce docket congestion. The drafting process, held in public hearings in June and July 2033, revealed the tensions we had anticipated. Activists raised alarms that formalization could be weaponized to tuck family-provided care into estates in ways that reduced claimants' access to public benefits. The bill's sponsors listened, and in September 2033 the legislature amended the draft to include a safeguard clause. No family schedule, promissory note, or memorandum could be used to diminish an individual's eligibility for means-tested public benefits unless the person signing had independent legal advice documented at the time of execution. The statute passed in October 2033 and went into effect on January 1, 2034. It did not erase the past, it mapped a different set of expectations. For people with a loose habit of promising and a fragile public safety net, the law was a mixed blessing. It made certain kinds of documentation more enforceable going forward, but it also preserved a firewall that kept family accounting from substituting for public provision. In public talks I applauded the law's pragmatism, an effort to balance dignity and protection, but I continued to urge public investment in elder care and housing so that families would not be compelled to perform roles they were ill-equipped to sustain. At home, the rhythm of ordinary care moved forward in incremental ways. In the winter of 2032 my mother and I instituted a rule, born of repeated miscommunication, that any transfer over $2,000 required a brief checklist: purpose, expected repayment, if any, witness signatures, and a copy stored at the bank's customer service office under an agreed code. The threshold was arbitrary, but it worked as a conversational prompt. Over the next 3 years we used the checklist perhaps a dozen times. Dinners, a small roof repair, a temporarily higher grocery bill. Each time I felt less like an accountant guarding an injury and more like an adult sibling practicing the language of stewardship. The promissory note remained in the drawer. It retained a weight as artifact, a ledger entry now folded into a larger history. There were, inevitably, moments of relapse. In August 2034, a small family dispute in a neighboring county blew up into litigation that made the local news. A brother had verbally promised to care for an aging parent in exchange for a promise of future inheritance. When the parent executed a new will that omitted the brother, he produced a stack of undated emails and a jotted memo and demanded enforcement. The county court, citing the statute of 2033 and the evidentiary guidelines from the appellate decision of 2032, required a showing that the alleged promise met the formalities. The litigation was costly, acrimonious, and instructive. It showed that documentation, far from being a panacea, is a kind of grammar that must be learned and practiced if it is to be useful. The case settled after mediation in December 2034 with a modest cash payment and a facilitated family plan for caregiving. Less the triumph of documentation than the triumph of bringing in neutral processes before grievance calcified into litigation. My public work broadened in scope. In 2034 I co-organized a national symposium, held in October at the law school where I taught, titled Promises, Probate, and Public Goods. The symposium convened judges who had adopted the 2028 judicial guidance, clerks who had administered the pilot clinics, sociologists studying intergenerational transfers, and advocates from both sides of the debate about private documentation and public support. The papers, later published in a 2035 special issue of a Lawrence Society journal, traced the policy arc from the Family Loan Clause to the 2033 statute and explored comparative practices in other states and countries. Some contributors argued for more aggressive statutory recognition of family instruments. Others urged that documentation be tightly circumscribed so as not to supplant public responsibility. The conversation was not resolved in a single volume. It continued, in conferences and in the garden parties where county clerks and non-profit directors traded notes. There were personal developments that paralleled the institutional arc. In the spring of 2035 my mother experienced a fall that required a brief rehabilitation stay. Because we had maintained the practice of contemporaneous documentation and witness forms, we were able to secure a modest reimbursement from a cousin who had agreed, in 2027, to share certain caregiving expenses. That agreement had originally been an offhand plan recorded in an email. In 2028 we had formalized the arrangement with a witness checklist. The episode felt like vindication for the mundane discipline we had adopted. Documentation sometimes mattered in the small, day-to-day logistics of care as much as in the height drama of probate. The promissory note's presence in my drawer became, over time, a kind of pedagogical object. Students in my clinic would ask to see it, anonymized of course, and I would show the handwriting, the laugh scrawl of my father in the margin, the date, and the lack of witnesses. They would lean in and ask why I had converted it into a claim rather than letting it remain an artifact. I would answer with the same humility and complexity I had rehearsed in public, because the note was implicated in future expectations, because leaving it undocumented introduced moral hazard and the possibility of silence, because my mother deserved clarity, and because sometimes the act of formalizing is an act of care. The students would take this back to their clients with a slightly steadier voice. Not all stories in this period were measured or legalistic. There were small reconciliations that felt less like tidy reconciliations and more like altered patterns of relating. In November 2036 my sister, who had been distant during the years of the estate dispute, called to ask if she could accompany our mother to a cardiology appointment. We rode together in an elevator, exchanged the kind of practical pleasantries that constitute caregiving, and later shared coffee. She did not apologize in an expansive way. Apologies in families are rarely cinematic. She expressed instead a quiet recognition of the strain we had all lived under, and she said simply that she had read my essay in the 2030 anthology and wanted to learn more about the clinics. We planned, tentatively, to attend a workshop together the following spring. Small acts like that, shared time, mutual presence, registered for me as forms of repair that no promissory note could command. By 2037, the institutional experiment had become part of the ecosystem. Several counties had adopted the checklist model for clerks. The pilot clinics had been replicated, in adapted form, in 2 neighboring states, and the 2033 statute had inspired a model law proposal circulated by the National Council of Probate Administrators in late 2036. Critics remained, particularly among advocates for expanded public benefits who argued that any policy that normalizes family responsibility risks entrenching inequality. I agreed with that caution and continued to push publicly for parallel investment in affordable housing, caregiver supports, and long-term care insurance options. My message remained the same: documentation is a tool, it is neither sufficient nor morally exclusive. The unsecured claim against my father's estate remained a factual persistence in my household ledger. It was never erased, but it stopped functioning as a living demand on daily life. The $1,000 monthly payments the executor had arranged, spread over the months after the probate inventory was closed, had ceased when the estate's liquid funds were exhausted. The legal record showed the claim, and the promissory note remained a private memorial. My mother and I used the funds we had saved, emergency reserves and a modest reallocation of investments, to smooth the occasional gaps. We did not recover $144,000. We recovered something else, a way to live with the memory of expectations that were never fully honored and a set of practices that reduced the chance that future promises would be similarly lost to laughter. There were broader cultural shifts as well. Between 2034 and 2038, a series of popular books and podcasts began to examine intergenerational money with a more sociological lens. Journalists cited our region's clinics as examples of what low-cost legal interventions could do in a frayed civic infrastructure. Radio producers called to ask whether a promissory note could be a line in a larger story about care work. I participated in panels, not to generalize the particularities of my family into a blueprint for all, but to insist that policy should be informed by discrete experience, by the ledger entries, the witness forms, and the small rituals families use to make promises accountable. Through all this, the sound of my father's laugh persisted as a polyphonic refrain. In moments of tenderness, it recalled a man who loved to deflect seriousness with humor, who made pancakes and told jokes to ease the constant gray of finances. In moments of anger, it sounded like an instrument of belittlement, an effort to turn debt into a punchline so that responsibility might evaporate. Over time I learned to hear the laugh as a composite, part affection, part flippancy, part evasion. That recognition did not excuse what happened, it contextualized it. In the classroom and in policy meetings I repeatedly returned to one conviction, that law is best when it is modest about what it can do and ambitious about the forms of support it seeks to enable. The formalization of family promises can reduce certain harms. It cannot substitute for a robust social infrastructure that prevents families from being default insurers. The promissory note in my drawer, $144,000 written in my father's hand, had been the spark for a decade of work that clarified instruments, created clinics, guided judges, and, in small ways, altered how my family inventoried care. It had not made me whole. It had not even restored the arithmetic of expectation. But it had taught me to make space for contradiction, to litigate when necessary and to teach when possible, to hold the ledger without letting it become the only story, to insist on public solutions even as we used private instruments to manage immediate fragility. The years ahead promised more iterations of these tensions. There were pending research grants to evaluate the long-term outcomes of the clinics, a proposed legislative amendment to refine witness requirements set to be debated in the 2039 session, and a small convening planned for spring 2038 that would bring together family mediation specialists, county clerks, and young adults who had come of age amid these changes. At home my mother and I continued our monthly account reviews, the shared spreadsheet, and the two-witness rule for significant transfers, and the promissory note remained duly folded, in the same drawer as a reminder that promises, like families, require maintenance and that the work of translating private loss into public practice is an ongoing, provisional project. The spring convening in 2038 proceeded much as we had hoped. In April we gathered mediators, county clerks, young adults who had lived through the shift, and a handful of skeptical advocates. We read the preliminary designs for a short attestation form and debated its language until one clerk, with 30 years of intake experience, said simply, "Make it short enough that people will use it, precise enough that judges will give it weight." Out of that weekend came two concrete outputs, a template attestation that emphasized contemporaneity and a companion training module for clerks and mediators to deploy it. The module prioritized plain language, a two-witness rule for transfers above a statutory threshold, and a protocol for preserving emails and text threads. We circulated these materials to municipalities that had adopted the checklist model and, by late 2038, several counties were piloting the module with modest technical assistance. The research grants I had helped to shepherd were awarded in the autumn of 2038. Funders, the State Research Office and a private foundation interested in long-term care, committed 3 years of support to evaluate the clinic's effects on contested probate filings, caregiving arrangements, and household financial stability. Preliminary surveys in mid-2019. Sorry, mid-2019 is outside the chronology. Preliminary surveys in mid-2039 showed fewer surprise claims in households that used the attestation and slightly higher rates of informal cost-sharing agreements being honored. The data were cautious. Reductions in litigation costs appeared small but consistent, and the social work literature emphasized that documentation was one part of a constellation that included mediation, affordable supports, and public benefits.